welcome to Fruity Knitting. This is episode 105. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Andrea. And we love to show a wide variety of knitting styles and techniques on the show. And we've also featured small amounts of other related crafts like crochet and spinning and weaving and even a bit of sewing. But up until now, we haven't done an in-depth feature on machine knitting. And I know some of our viewers are machine knitters and others like myself have an interest in learning more about it. So finally, we are really thrilled to present what we think is a really good interview with Susan Guagliumi. Susan has had a long career teaching machine knitting in quite a few different countries. Her books and online courses are highly regarded, and we think with her experience, she's just the perfect person to introduce us into the world of machine knitting. Now, this is an area that I knew nothing about prior to researching for this interview. So we've made it into a two-part interview, and I've tried to cover as many different angles as possible so that we can get a really comprehensive introduction to the craft. We also thought it would be fabulous if we could feature a hobby machine knitter in the same episode, so alongside the expert. So for Knitters of the World, we're going to Switzerland to meet Jackie, and Jackie's been a really passionate machine knitter for the last 4 years, and she actually knits hand knitting designs on the knitting machine, which is really interesting. I didn't know that you could do that actually.
Yeah.
And she works on a Caitlin Hunter design during the segment, so you'll really enjoy it.
Yeah, and we also like to delve into history whenever we can to see if there's an interesting story for you. So I'm going to tell you about the very first knitting machine, which was invented in 1589. Now, if you've watched the show for a while, you've probably noticed that we always have flowers on the table back there. I buy those flowers from a local open-air market here in Offenbach, and whenever I can, I get flowers that are grown in the region here. Well, it's a flower rose time right now here in Hessen. So
they're all blooming.
Today we're taking you to the oldest rose nursery in Germany, and that's at Steinfurt. It's actually quite famous, just about half an hour's drive from here. And we've got a mini interview with the breeder there. They have over 1,000 different varieties of roses. We're going to be taking the drone out to see them in the fields. We've also got some nice footage closer up, so that's coming up. And of course, we've got updates on our own projects, and we're going to start with that in under construction.
So my new project is coming on really well. I'm really thrilled with it. It's the Lanzalou by Jennifer Beale. Here's a picture of the design so you can see what it's going to look like when it's finished. And I'm knitting it with John Arbon's Sportweight yarn, Yarnadelic, in the colourway Pink Moon and Baddy Dar. So this design has such a super fun construction. And I went through in quite a lot of detail how it works in the last episode. And I also told you that I'm doing it at a completely different gauge than what the pattern recommends. So that means that I've had to rework all the maths and the stitch counts. I think so far I'm getting it correct, which is a good relief. Yeah, but it's been fun to do that, actually. It makes you feel more confident if you get away with it, if it's successful. Yep. Okay, so like I said, I went into a lot of detail about it, how the construction works in the last episode, and I drew this picture because it was easier to explain that. But right now, just for any new viewers, I want to summarize again very quickly so people understand what I'm talking about. So you can see that it's a dolman-shaped sweater. It's done top down, and it's got 3/4 length sleeves, so they come just a little bit below the elbow. And running down the tops of the sleeves are these long, thin panels of colour work, and that's actually where you start the design, which is interesting. And you do these two panels together in the round with 2 sets of steeking stitches, and it looks like this. So this is all curling up because it's stocking stitch, but you've got your steeking stitches in there, you reinforce them on the sewing machine and you cut it open. And in the last episode, I actually show you footage of me reinforcing it on the sewing machine and cutting it open. Because if you haven't seen it, it's great to see it and you'll see how easy it is. It's really simple. It doesn't take much time at all. So once you've cut it open, you've got your 2 thin panels. Along one edge, you pick up stitches all along one edge, and then you start in the corner at the neck edge and you work down in stocking stitch, and you're gradually increasing your rows and collecting more stitches in short rows from that edge of stitches that you picked up. And then at the neck edge, you sort of increase a few stitches just to get that neck edge curve. So you do that down to the bottom of the neck. You stop there and you do exactly the same on this side. So pick up stitches and work down to the bottom of the neck. So then you've got 2 sections. The bottom of the neck, you join them together, and you continue working in really long rows, picking up more and more stitches each row along the panels, right until you get down to the sleeves and to this broad band of colourwork that runs across the chest. Then you stop again and you do exactly the same thing on the other side, on the back side, except for the back neck's a little bit higher. So if you can just hold, that's what I got up to in the last episode. So you can see that that's the panel of colourwork that runs down the left sleeve, and that's one that runs down the right sleeve. You can see that the front, so there's the front and there's the back, and they look pretty much the same except for the neck edge on the front is slightly lower. Okay, so then coming back to the design, this broad band of colourwork is really interesting because it's on the same place, in the same position on the front as it is on the back, just like I showed you. Exactly the same pattern, same position. So what Jennifer does is get you to put some sticking stitches in at the cuffs, both cuffs. So then you knit right across the front, through the sticking stitches, right across the back, and you do the whole thing in a massive round, okay? Until you get to the end of that section. And then you sew the sticks on the sewing machine, cut them open, okay? And then you can once again stick your hands through the cuffs like that. Now, if you look back here, you can see that underneath the sleeves, running along the inside of the sleeves and down the sides of the body, is another long, thin panel of colourwork, which is kind of just mirroring the panel that runs along the top of the sleeves. It's actually the same pattern, but you don't do it the same way. So you're here, the front and back have been cut open through the sticks here, so now you go back to working flat, and you work in stocking stitch on the front, down like this, doing short rows to create that dolman sleeve, all the way down. You just forget about the colourwork for now, down to the end, and you do the same to the back. And then you've already got some stitches that are left on the needle from the short row shaping. You pick up some more down the sides, and then you can start knitting that panel of colourwork. And here it is here, that's on the left sleeve. And you can see it's the same pattern as the panel that goes down the top of the sleeves. And it's actually a really easy panel. So you could choose to do this back and forth and purl, you know, like purl on the wrong side and knit on the right side. But I think Jennifer's making this design a study in steeking because she gets you to steek it instead. So she puts in some steeking stitches to join the cuff to the hem, and then you knit round and round like this. So this one I've completed. I've sewn it on the sewing machine and I've cut it open. But this side, I left it so you can see it. So I haven't yet sewn the steeks and cut it open, but that's what it looks like. So that's the cuff and that's the hem, and you're knitting round and round in a circle, and then you reinforce the steeks and cut it open, and it will look like this. So that's pretty cool. So as you can see, I haven't cast off at the end of the colourwork. So I've got all of these live stitches, and you've got live stitches on the back panel. So if I turn it around, you can see that's the back panel. So that's actually what it looked like before you start doing that panel. And these stitches get grafted to these stitches like that. So you do the panels connected to the front. The colourwork panels are connected to the front piece, and then you graft them to the back piece, and that's how you get the jumper to be 3D or completely round.
It's not a poncho anymore.
So it's not a poncho. So it's super fun. You can tell that she's just having such a game with herself.
Yeah.
Playing like, how can I do this? So it's a study in steeking, but it's also a study in short rows and a study in grafting. It's an etude. So it's really cool. Now there's just one thing more I want to talk about, and that's this broad band of colourwork that runs across the chest and the sleeves. When I was doing that, as you can see, you're doing the front and the back all in one round, so your knitting gets quite bunched up, and I did it on a cord that was about 80 centimetres. And I got a bit lazy. Normally what I do, I always do a swatch before I start a project, both on the colour work and on the stocking stitch, to make sure my stitch counts are correct. And normally when I'm working on a design, I will stop and measure my gauge to make sure that it's actually the same as my swatch and I'm staying on track. Well, I didn't do it here. I got too lazy to spread the knitting out on 2 needles so that I could lie it flat and check my gauge, and it was only a small amount. I just simply got too lazy. So when I cut the steeks open, I realized that my gauge was tighter than my swatch, and so I'd lost some centimeters width across here, which is actually pretty important. So I thought, oh God, should I cut it off and start again? And I thought, no, I'll try blocking it. So I soaked it and blocked it first, and I was able to get pretty easily those extra centimeters that I was missing. But the problem is, from now on end, every time I wash this garment, I can't just casually throw it down on the floor and let it dry naturally. I have to measure it out and block it again. And the time that it'll take me to do that every time I wash it will way outdo the time it would have taken for me to put the garment on 2 needles and lie it flat and measure it. So learn that lesson. Don't be lazy like I was. Anyway, it's coming on, it's exciting, and hopefully I'll have a lot more to show you in the next episode.
We're continuing in Under Construction with my Bowie top by Lisa Richardson, and I thought I'd start with a little bit of background research, so I jumped into Ravelry. There are 20 projects on this design listed there, 3 of them complete. I checked out their knitting times for the completed projects because that is a bit of a concern for me. The first knit I had taken 83 days. The second one said 21. The third one who had completed didn't put down any dates, so that doesn't help me at all. I figured this is the 3rd episode where I'm mentioning this top, so I'm already at 28 days on my account.
But Dale, most of that time was spent learning to flick on a large swatch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
You've got to give yourself
still
a
had
break.
to be done. Yep. Anyway, also in Ravelry, I looked up the designer, Lisa Richardson. She has 722 designs listed, which I thought was pretty impressive. And one of those designs is, of course, this one here. This is Ashy, which is, of course, our title sweater.
So it's what you see at the beginning of every episode.
Yep.
And it's my favourite one for you. I love this design.
We both love this.
Yeah.
It gets a lot of wear. And actually, one of our patrons was asking about this just this week. So there you go.
Yeah. I'd love to interview her.
Yes.
Hopefully she'll say yes one day. Okay.
So onto my progress. In the last episode, I did mention that, I was working on the swatch, as Andrea said, and the challenge was that I'm using the flicking technique, which is new to me. So I have gradually improved on that technique up to the point where Andrea said I could actually start the real project. And so here is the progress that I've made since then. I hope that's impressive. The good thing about it, they're really small stitches, dolls.
I know. It's all right. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
Right. Oh, then I'm reassured. The good thing is that my gauge is pretty much spot on for the recommended gauge using the suggested needle, so that's kind of nice.
Oh, we're aiming for you to be a little bit tighter because we've gone up a size. We'll talk about this later.
Yeah. So I did, if you might recall, in the last episode, I said that my previous technique, I was getting 3.5 seconds per stitch. That's what I measured roughly. That's using the throwing techniques. And that's why I started learning this flicking. Well, I did a measurement across this piece. So it's a nice 150 stitches wide. So it's a good sort of stretch to measure. And I came out with about just under 3.5 seconds per stitch for knit stitches. Purl is really difficult. That came to a bit over 4 seconds per stitch. So I'm actually worse than I was before. But I am going to persist with it because I figure I've got 49,000 stitches to practice on here, so that's good. Should improve on its own, and I'm just going to try and do some sort of careful practice and technique work.
With me?
And you can help me. And we'll both be very patient.
Yes.
And I hope
that'll be fun.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get something from that as far as speed, but the other thing that we need to watch is the gauge. Yeah. Hopefully my gauge doesn't go here and then there. And,
yeah, that'd be sad.
The other thing, very quickly on speed, I did notice that Diana of Diana Knits is also doing this top, but she's knitted the front and back, so the body, using a machine. which did make me think that she probably did a row of stitches in less time than it takes me to do one purl stitch.
Don't think about that too much.
Which is an interesting thought for me to carry with me through my next 49,000 stitches. The other thing I thought is, in part 2 of our interview today with Susan, she mentions the price of an entry-level knitting machine.
Yeah, they're quite cheap.
It's really quite reasonable. And I thought I did, a few quick calculations. I figured, all right, let's value my time at $5 per hour for my skilled labour, which I think is reasonable. I think we could pay off a knitting machine on this one project.
But only if we sell it, Dales. Otherwise, it's all mental. If we sell it,
or if I do something else worthwhile.
Like go and pick strawberries for $5
Go and pick strawberries. And Madeline was talking about going. Anyway, that's that. The other question is whether you would appreciate it as much if it wasn't sort of infused with my blood, sweat and tears.
Well, that should only happen figuratively.
Figuratively or literally.
Because this is meant to be an elegant garment.
It can always be washed. It may need to be washed. 50,000 stitches, I don't think tears are out of the question, darling.
I'll really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's good, but you've got to show the lace because the lace is stunning.
That. The progress on the lace is much more satisfying. Here it is.
Yeah, I'll hold it like that for you.
I think you can see it looks stunning.
I blocked it out.
Yeah, something I've really seen from doing this is that my basic knitting has really improved. So I can get through, there's a whole lot of different stitches in there and I can get through them without too much trouble. And I think the key to that is really holding, with my left hand, actually holding the work and not holding the needle, which you've always told me to do. I know that. But the thing is, my experience is when I was starting, it was just too scary to let go of the needle. You'd think everything's going to fly everywhere and then you've lost the stitches.
Then it's likely to fly. So what he's talking about is if you hold the work just underneath the needle, you can pull it down. It's easier to get your needle in. And also by holding it, you're stopping it falling off.
Yeah,
and
it's true.
There's a whole lot of really handy things if you're very dexterous with these fingers. You have to be like a crab,
right,
and work.
So there's lots of slip, nip one, pass, slip stitches over, and I just get through them without. Yeah, they don't faze me, even with a yarn over thrown in. I pick out the 2 slipped ones and do it. So that's really good. The big challenge with the lace is keeping track of where I am. So I work at the kitchen table back there, so not here on the couch. And I actually have my 2 cards there, so I only get to see one row at a time.
He's blowing up the instructions.
Yeah, so I've kind of got my blinkers on like this. And then the next challenge is keeping track of where I am in each row, because each row is actually quite long. Right now it's about 240 stitches in a row. And what I've seen is the rows are often sort of beginning stitches and then say 5 times this chunk and then a few middle stitches and then 5 times this chunk and then the end. And I need to keep track of those 5 times, or now it's even 11 times something. And my high-tech solution to that is I have a row of actually 1-cent pieces on the table, and as I do each of those repeats, I just shove the coin over to the side.
Otherwise, you've got to go back and count a lot.
And that's really bad.
Because these few stitches in the middle could be very similar to one of those 5 times, but slightly different.
Yeah.
And so it's a good thing. He looks hilarious though. Maybe I'll film you sometime.
Yeah, great.
But look, this is what it's going to look like. It's a sleeve like this.
Yeah, and I don't think there are any mistakes in there.
It's beautiful. And then afterwards, you've got to knit a panel of lace going this way.
Sideways, yep.
But it's stunning knitting. And I had a go. I did a couple of rows on the very long rows, and it's actually challenging lace.
Yeah.
It's challenging lace.
Yeah, well, I'm really enjoying it. I kind of figure it's just the perfect mix for me of being challenging, so it's not just boring, and still being manageable, so I'm not just upset all the time or asking for help. And it's really satisfying, obviously.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful, so it's good.
I love it. It's going to be great. Welcome to Fruity Knitting. Over the last 4 years that we've been interviewing various experts in the knitting industry, I would periodically get a request to feature an expert on machine knitting. Now, like many hand knitters, I previously didn't know much at all about machine knitting, but it's gradually become more interesting to me, and this actually reflects what happens historically, because whenever there's been a resurgence in hand knitting, there's also a resurgence in machine knitting. So I am thrilled to have the machine knitting expert Susan Guagliumi as our guest today. Susan's career as an educational specialist in machine knitting industry has spanned more than 25 years. She's travelled to various countries teaching machine knitting, and her books and online courses are highly regarded amongst machine knitters. So Susan, I'm thrilled that you've agreed to come on Fruity Knitting for an interview. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's a whole new audience for me.
Okay, now I like to include a bit of a historical background for our viewers, particularly with new subjects, and we haven't had machine knitting on the show before. So could you give us a brief history on manual machine knitting, and then just end by saying what you think machine knitting can offer hand knitters?
Sure. Back in the 1500s in England, there was a minister who was frustrated by how long it took his wife to knit his stockings. And he developed what's considered the first knitting frame. It's called the lamb frame. And after that time, there were all kinds of innovations that were made. The guilds, the hand knitting guilds, had their say on what would or wouldn't happen. The Queen had lots of input. And the industry began to grow. It was probably the first thing that made stockings available to the more average person. They'd been for royalty before that. The machines developed in a pretty much industrial vein until the 1900s. And then companies in Asia and Europe began to produce domestic or home model machines that people could use to knit sweaters and garments for their families. And the initial machines were fairly rudimentary. They were very manual machines, which means that any patterning or special techniques were done with hands and special tools to manipulate the stitches. When we got into the 1960s, 70s, the machines began to incorporate what's called punch card patterning, where you had cards with holes punched in there that basically dictated to the needles what to do when. Knit blue stitches or knit white stitches. And then, of course, as computers became more commonplace in people's homes, the machines became electronic and then computerized. So we're at the point right now where, for example, you could use some software called Design-A-Knit to design patterns, both stitch patterns and garment structural patterns, on your computer and then port it over to the knitting machine. It's a pretty exciting time for knitters right now because the equipment has gotten so sophisticated.
And has this mainly been led in, say, America, the development of the machines, or Japan, or who's sort of been at the forefront?
It's interesting because the machines that probably had the widest distribution were the Japanese-produced machines. And the Japanese have a reputation for fine detail and innovation, and that certainly was true with the machines. But there were 2 European machines as well, and they developed on slightly different lines. All the machines have something a little bit different from the others that they do. Some do one kind of patterning or structure better than another.
So what do you think machine knitting can offer hand knitters?
Exploration, a shorter learning curve to become a really good knitter. In hand knitting, it takes years to really develop some speed with a pair of sticks. Whereas on a knitting machine, the initial learning curve may be a little bit steeper, but then it flattens out after that. So it's not unthinkable that someone who has just purchased a knitting machine 2 months from now could be doing a very elaborate ferrule design, for example, or tuck stitches, or intarsia stitches. The machine makes it all very accessible. And there are some techniques that are indisputably faster on a machine. Stockinette or jersey is is just a piece of cake. Intarsia knitting is easier to do on a machine. It keeps all of your bobbins separate and you can see the work. Short rowing is much easier to understand because you can physically see the short rows. At the same time, some stitches are not so easy on a machine. Garter stitch and knit purl combinations just aren't practical on most domestic knitting machines.
So have you got some samples there that you can show us?
I do. I've got a couple of my favorite sweaters. This was a vest that I did a number of years ago from an Alice Starmore pattern. I tend to like a lot of the hand knit patterns and the hand knit yarns, and that really influences the choices that I make when I decide to knit something. And this particular sweater has a hand knit rib on it because this kind of rib would not be easy or reasonable to do on a machine. But the rest of it was all done on what we call a standard gauge machine. So that's pretty typical of the kind of thing that people like to do. Unfortunately, a lot of machine knitters aren't adventurous enough to keep changing colors the way the hand knitters do, and that's sometimes been the hallmark of machine knitting. This sweater is a domino or a modular kind of a knit, very much the way you do it by hand, where you knit one section and then pick up stitches off the selvage edge of the first piece to knit the second one. So this one is, I think you see the back even a little bit better. One of my favorite sweaters. And again, a hand knitting yarn. This is one of the Noro yarns that changes colors all by itself. So it adds even more intrigue and interest, I think, to the sweater.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
This is one of the garments that was done for my last book. And it's something that I call winged ladders. And it's also a modular kind of knitting that's done in bands, where one band is completed and then the next one is picked up off of the edge of that to do the following bands.
Okay, so why did you start machine knitting? Like early on, I know that you worked for the Silver Reed Company. How did that set you on your path to become such a highly recognised authority on machine knitting?
I started out as a weaver, and when I finished graduate school, there were not a lot of jobs for weavers around. In fact, I don't think there are ever a lot of jobs for weavers. But I went into New York City in June of that particular year to attend a yarn show, and they offered a free workshop on using a knitting machine, and in about 15 minutes, I was hooked. I was totally seduced by the machines, because one of the things about weaving that I always found so frustrating is that you spend so much time setting up the loom and making all those decisions in advance of actually seeing the fabric that when things don't quite work out, you sometimes feel stuck. With a knitting machine, you can rethread in 3 minutes, try a new color combination, try a new stitch pattern, and the possibilities just seemed endless to me. So when I got back from that workshop, I wrote the company a letter and I told them why they should hire me, that I hadn't seen any knitting machines anywhere in my area, and that I certainly would have noticed them had they been around. So I said I'd be perfectly willing to learn the machine and work for them. And they said, yes, that would be great. They sent me out 2 machines, the French and the Swiss machines. And over that summer, I learned the machines enough that by the fall, I was on the road throughout New England, selling and demonstrating and teaching the machine, training dealers as well.
Now, your academic background, you've done that in special education. That must have helped you also with your teaching.
It has helped, and interestingly enough, it's really given me a little bit of insight into working with adults. I've found over the years that when you teach children, they expect to make mistakes. And even when I've taught children how to use the knitting machine, if something goes wrong, they just pass it off. They say, okay, I'll do it again. Whereas adults tend to pull back and say, oh, this is too hard for me. I can't do this. I can't do this. Adults sometimes aren't open to mistakes. And I've been known to say on many occasions that my very best teachers were my very worst mistakes. So in working with adults, I've tried to evaluate whether I'm dealing with somebody who learns by seeing and hearing and explanations, reading, or whether it's someone who's only going to learn and get things straight by sitting at the machine and going from there.
Now, what are some of the differences, the basic differences between how a hand knitter and machine knitter will work and think about their projects?
Hand knitters tend to think about knitting stitch by stitch, and then, of course, row by row. Machine knitters work on a row-to-row basis usually. What I do is a little bit different because I work with a lot of hand-manipulated stitches, so I am thinking about stitches. But in general, machine knitters are thinking row by row. And one of the nice things is that knitting machines all have row counters that count the rows for you. So if you've done accurate gauging, you're likely to knit sleeves that are absolutely identical because the same number of rows will yield a piece the same size. Hand knitters sometimes have trouble managing gauge because it can change if your yarn is wound a little tighter or whatever. On a knitting machine, you're going to enjoy even stitches and perfect gauge if you're doing things right. On a knitting machine, we're always looking at the back side of the work. The purl side of the work is always facing us. And for some people, that can be a little bit distracting. You get used to it, but you need to keep that in mind, particularly if you're following charts that require you to do something on every other row. In hand knitting, the every other row would be the knit side. On a machine, every other row is still the purl or the back side of the work. So it gives us the advantage, instead of crossing a cable, for example, every 6 rows, if I think it would look better every 5 or every 7, it doesn't interrupt my flow at all. I can do it that way if I'd like to. So that I think is a really important consideration.
Just about gauge, the machine knitting stitch is kind of a different shape than a hand knitting stitch, isn't it? Just talk a bit about that, and how can you combine machine knitting and hand knitting in the same garment?
Good question. The row gauge tends to be the tougher one to match. Stitch gauge I can always match, just spot on with a hand knit gauge. But for example, with something like a DK that might knit at 5.5 stitches and 7 rows to the inch in hand knitting, I might end up with 7 3/4 rows per inch. So I would probably make some changes to the overall charting of the pattern. That's the place where you'd have to pay the most attention. There definitely is a difference in the row gauge.
Okay, now a lot of machine knitters also use hand knitting charts, don't they? Like ferrule charts or lace charts even, can't they? You can program that into a machine.
Well, some of it can be programmed in and some of it will guide you for hand manipulated stitches. Many machines have lace carriages available to them that do automatic transfers. So it literally moves the stitch from one needle to the next. Almost anything can be done as a hand manipulation, which is, remember I said that's how the early machines worked. They were strictly manual machines. The thing you need to know about a knitting machine before you even start to look at them is that on a knitting machine, every stitch has its own needle. So, in hand knitters, you're used to 2 sticks carrying, 150 stitches. If I need 150 stitches on a knitting machine, I need to have a machine that has 150 needles. And each of those needles operates like a little latch hook, is really the best way I can describe it, where there will be a stitch in the hook of each needle. And let me just lean back here for a second, as this carriage moves across the bed, it will push the needles forward and back and take new yarn into each stitch and release the old stitches from the needles. So every time that carriage slides across the entire bed, it will have knitted 150 stitches. It's the fastest stockinette knitting you'll ever see. Some machines are able, as I said, either with punch cards or electronics, to tell the carriage how to control the patterning, whether it's going to make a textured stitch or a plain stitch, a blue stitch or a white stitch. But with any of these machines, there are certain things that are always done with hand tools, and that would be increasing, decreasing. The machines don't do that for you. They don't shape things for you. If I'm going to cross cables, those are always done with 2 hand tools. I call them the great equalizer because no matter how much money you spend on your machine, that's how we cross cables. So the other thing with comparing hand to machine knitting, hand knitters can knit things in the round. On a knitting machine, it really isn't practical. With 2 beds of needles, you can knit in the round, but only one of the beds will knit in pattern. So it's just not a way to get a Fair Isle sweater done, for example. The other thing, hand knitters tend to knit 2 sleeves at the same time so that they're both going to fit the same person. And as I said before, because we have an accurate row counter on the machine, there's no reason to do that. A lot of things are visually easier to understand on a machine. I alluded to short rowing before. It has to do with the fact that the needles are popped right out into a position where you can see that they're not knitting. And I think that I've had lots of hand knitters say, I never understood short rows until I did it on a machine. There's a lot of things that are similar. I can weave in my ends while I'm working. I can do some of the finishing and the joining right on the machine in a way that mimics a hand knit finish. For example, I very often will join shoulders on the machine in a way that mimics a 3-needle bind off. So there are similarities and there are differences. And I think the thing that marks success for most hand knitters when they start working on a machine is being open to those differences as well as the similarities.
I thought it was really interesting to hear that Susan was a weaver, professionally trained weaver, before becoming a machine knitter. And to me, that seems like a really logical and easy transition from those 2 crafts to be able to do them. Because if you think about it, the action of the carriage on the knitting machine going back and forth is very similar to the shuttle on the weaving loom going back and forth. And for both crafts, you're sitting stationary, you've got the machine in front of you, and it's a pretty permanent setup. Yep. So I think sort of from a mental perspective and habitually, it would be an easy thing to go from weaving to machine knitting. Yep. So that's really interesting. So part 2 of the interview is coming up at the end of the program, and we cover a lot more to do with machine knitting. Susan talks about what machines are good to buy, which goes through a few different ones, and she also goes through her education material in case you're interested in learning how to do machine knitting. And she shows us some pretty amazing swatches with very fancy stitch patterns involving slits and holes and tucks and knots. And
she's got some really interesting techniques there.
Quite amazing things that you can do. Looks like pretty easily on a knitting machine. Yep. So she goes through that, and she also talks about her experience of teaching people machine knitting in different countries and what different cultures are sort of focusing on, which I found interesting. Yep. So there's lots more to see. That was just a taste. And Susan is offering Fruity Knitting patrons a 15% discount off her teaching books and a 25% discount off her online courses. This is a really great offer, so if you've been wanting to explore the craft of machine knitting, now might be a great opportunity to look into it. And all the details for the discount are on the Fruity Knitting Patreon page as usual.
Susan mentioned the invention of the knitting machine very briefly, but I really love these old machines, so I looked into it all a little bit more, and I wanted to tell you about some of the things that I found. So here's a picture of an early knitting machine. So the first knitting machine was invented by a man called William Lee in 1589. It was actually called the stocking frame because stockings were the most commonly knitted item at the time. There are several different stories about how Lee came to invent this machine, but they all involve his wife, who did knit to supplement the family income, which was really common at the time. So one of the stories is that they were freshly married, and Lee just wanted more of the time and attention that his wife was giving to her knitting. That sounds a little bit modern to me, although I'm sure there was some truth in it. I think a more likely 16th century explanation was that Lee wanted to ease her burden a little. I suspect she was knitting from morning till night and just improve their lot in life. There was one account from 1715 that I found, and it goes like this. The scholar Lee, often fixing his eyes on the dexterous management of the needles by his wife, he thought it was possible to contrive a little loom to do the work with more expedition. This thought he communicated to his wife. He joined his head to her hands, and the endeavour succeeded to their wish. This is a very romantic account.
It is.
And this account goes on to say that Lee became a man of considerable wealth, but that's not actually true. Lee left his job. He and his wife never got to enjoy the fruits of his work. He left his job and took his invention to London to promote it, and he met with Queen Elizabeth I, but she refused to grant him a patent because she was concerned that this machine would destroy the hand knitting cottage industry, which really did support a lot of families at the time. So failing there, Lee took his invention to France and he met with King Henry IV. And he did win favour with King Henry, and King Henry had promised him a patent. But shortly after that, the king was assassinated, and Lee was left without any support, and he actually died in France in poverty, which is pretty tragic.
Yeah.
But Lee was working together with his brother, James, and James took some of the machines that they had created, I guess they were prototypes essentially, took them back to London together with one of their assistants, a man named Ashton. And the two of them were able to successfully promote the machine, and it did come into production use, and that was early in the 17th century.
So about, 20 years afterwards or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So it took some time. And the knitting frame, stocking frame or knitting frame, it did disrupt the hand knitting industry, but not quite in the way that Queen Elizabeth probably had feared. The thing was, operating a knitting frame was really heavy work. And so the normal arrangement was that a household would lease one of these frames because they were quite expensive themselves. And the man of the household, so say the husband, would work the frame. And I think the wife and maybe the kids as well would do finishing work. And together they were able to create finished stockings, and they would sell those. And for around 200 years, they could actually make a good living from that. So
a family could.
Yeah, so a family would make a living from a stocking frame. It was all okay. But towards the end of the 18th century, I have to get it right, 18th century, the textile mills start to emerge. They've got new technology and they're using cheaper, less skilled labour. And that really pushed down the prices of all these knitted garments. And it got to the point where a normal frame knitter, as they were called, couldn't make a living anymore. They couldn't compete with the mills. And that's when you start to get the expression poor as a stockinger, which means these families would make stockings. So that was that. Things turned pretty terrible then. But you have the knitting frame invented in 1589. Now that seemed really early to me.
Yeah.
And I thought, how does that fit into the whole context of the textile industry? So I was thinking, you've got weaving and you've got spinning. And how does that timeline fit together? So I looked into that. So the big breakthrough for weaving was the invention of what's called the flying shuttle. And that happened in 1733. Here's a picture of the flying shuttle. So originally with weaving, you had a loom and you had the shuttle, and you would just pass it from one hand to the other if it was a narrow loom. So one operator passed the shuttle through the loom to the other side. If it was a wide loom, you'd actually have one person standing on each end of the loom, and they would reach in and pass it to each other, and you're doing whatever you're doing with the warp in between.
What a job.
That would have been
this all day.
I think that would have been a pretty terrible job.
Yeah.
And I suspect it would have been the women doing that because it's light work, but still.
Yeah.
Anyway, the flying shuttle was designed to essentially be thrown through the machine. And there was actually a mechanism for the operator where he could essentially give it a whack and send it flying down from one end of the loom to the other. And that meant that the loom was much faster, and it also meant that you could operate a wide loom with only a single operator,
so
only one person instead
expensive,
of yeah. Now, the bottleneck in cloth production had always been spinning the yarn. Okay, so they say that a single loom would take maybe 4 spinners to keep it supplied with enough yarn to keep the loom busy. And that was before the invention of the flying shuttle. So the shuttle comes along, the flying shuttle comes along, and maybe it's 3 or 4 times faster. So you might need, instead of 4 spinners, you might need 8 or 12 or even more to keep this loom busy. And the other thing is you now only have one operator on the loom. And the labour costs were significant in the cost of the cloth. So that meant that a significant portion of the cost of the cloth is in the spinners.
Yeah, so that's motivation to do...
That's right. So the flying shuttle puts all this pressure to reduce the cost of producing yarn. And that happened, the big improvement there happened in 1765 with what's called the spinning jenny. And I think we've got a picture of that here too. So the spinning jenny was still hand operated, so it was powered by hand, but they automated the process of drawing the yarn. And because they did that, it meant that you could have 8 spools or even more working at the same time by a single operator. So it scaled that up a lot.
So instead of having 8 spinners, it's just one.
Just one. And then in the next few years, they sort of improved on that. And there was a thing called the water frame developed. And the water means that it's powered by water. And that let them scale that even more. So that brought down the cost of that. So they're the 2 big changes in weaving and spinning. So if you look at it, you've got the flying shuttle in 1733 and the spinning jenny in 1765. Then 1589, so 140 or 170 years earlier, you've got the knitting frame by William Lee. And to me, the knitting frame is pretty complex. So it's a pretty extraordinary achievement. I mean, just the idea, you take knitting, which is normally done on 2 needles. He had the idea of putting it on 1 stitch per needle.
Yeah,
which
and
is
to have a bent stitch.
Yeah, he's got this thing called the bearded needle, which is how he managed to get it that you could get a loop, pull a loop over another piece of yarn, right, to actually make the steps. Really incredibly clever things, really brilliant.
Yeah.
And the tragedy is that he didn't benefit from it at all. That's just the way it goes sometimes. I think he was a bit ahead of his time.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing to find out these stories, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Andrew. So coming up now, very soon, you're going to meet Jackie, our hobby machine knitter. But before that, we're going to go to Steinfurt and go to the largest rose nursery in Germany, which is really beautiful. I'm here with Christian, who is the 5th generation in his family to be growing roses. So the Rosenhof Schultheiss is the oldest rose nursery in Germany. It goes back to 1868 here in Steinfurt. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Rosenhof and what you're offering now?
Yeah, now it's 152 years ago that my ancestor he was on his journeys as a gardener. He was in England and he learned how to cultivate roses and fruits. And with this knowledge he comes back from England let's say the roses were much more worse in Germany in these times than the fruits. So he kept the roses, not the fruits. Yeah? Okay. So it was our good luck. And in these times he started very quick with a huge company. We had up to 200 gardeners. And after 1 and the 2nd generation, these gardeners became their own nurseries. Yeah? And so whole Steinfurt became a nursery center for roses.
Okay.
That's the reason why here is the center. Often come people to us and say, why is Steinfurt so many rose people? And say, no, it's not so many. It was many. 200 rose nurseries. It's much in one place. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got over 1,000 varieties of roses here, and you're still developing more. So,
Yes.
what's the motivation to do that?
The problem is that I'm a breeder, and the breeder always thinks it can always be better. Yeah, because of course the old ones are nice. Yeah, and now we have them and we know them, and they have maybe a very good characteristic like very winter hardy, but we need very healthy roses. Yeah. Because we get rid of all the fungicides. No one wants to spray fungicides, and we need to protect the bees. Yeah, you're not allowed to take the insecticide in future. So what you need today is a very resistant rose, and the roses with fragrant are almost not so resistant.
Okay.
So our hugest aim is to have a very nice reblooming rose with very good, this very disease resistant and a very good fragrance, and that is very hard to breed. Yeah.
Okay.
And normally I can say if a rose has both of these characteristics, the second characteristic, the growth, the habit, is almost not nice.
Okay.
So it's very hard to breed like this.
So how long does it take to develop a new rose? How long are you working on a certain breed before you think, yes, it's finished?
Yeah. The normal process is about 7 to 8 years.
7 to 8
Yeah,
years?
yeah.
Okay.
It's a normal progress from the seedling to the introduction of the market. Yeah.
So what are you doing in that time? How do you develop it, or how are you putting two breeds together?
Let's say before you have to think what characteristics you can combine to a new rose, and then that's very hard because roses have very, very many genes, almost like humans. Yeah? And if you have a yellow and a yellow, you can't expect a yellow. You have to look in the
history.
Yes, what is inside? Yeah, and maybe there are reds and pink inside, and then if you have the seedlings, it's all pink. Yeah, so you have to know about the background. Yeah, otherwise it's only good luck.
Okay.
And you have
and
to.
And is grafting involved or not?
Later. No. In the first stage you have to think about it. Then of course you have a mother and a father, and you cross them, and then you get children.
Yeah.
And the children are not in your rows; it's only seedlings.
Yes.
Yeah, and out of these seedlings, in my bed there are almost about 2,000 to 5,000 seedlings, and then I pick out in the first stage the one I don't like.
Yeah.
And then every year I reduce the quantity and start to graft the ones I like. First in the first year 5, then 10, next year 20, and so I always
expand.
I always expand the quantities, and in the end I have up to 300 or 500 after 7 years. Only 2 left, and these are the novelties.
Right. We've got a couple of roses in front of us, and I think you're quite partial to them, aren't you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So why do you particularly like these breeds?
This one, let's say, was my novelty of 2000. Oh God, I think 13. It's a very naturous rose, and it's the bees love it very much. So I found the name Bee Lovely. Yeah. But it has a second meaning, because you have to lovely with it, because the thorns of this rose are very bad.
Oh, okay. So you have to touch it with kid gloves.
You have to be very
careful.
kind of on this rose. But it's very attractive to bees, and the bees smell the pollen. I don't know the name English for it, but and they come here and they're always on it. Yeah. So I said it's a very good bee rose. Yeah. So the next one, this is another breeding. It's called after the name of my wife. It's Manuela Schultheis, and it's a.
She's lucky.
Yeah. it's a crossing from an English rose and a French rose. So we can say it's a German rose with migration background.
Okay, okay, lovely. And does it have a good smell?
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So it has the good smell of the French father, and the growth of the English mother. Okay. Let's say. That's very nice. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jackie Ertley, and I'm machine knitting as a hobby here at my house. And I learned how to machine knit 4 years ago. I had signed up for a 1-week course where I would be machine knitting for 5 full days, and I had never seen a machine before. I also am not a hand knitter, so I went online and I found Susan Guagliumi's courses and found those extremely useful. I watched those classes again and again until I really felt like comfortable with the idea of how does the machine work, and also the whole knitting process. Before that, I really didn't have a firm idea of what is a knit stitch and what is a purl stitch. So I went into the course. It was held in German. I was able to make it through. I enjoyed it very much. I came home, bought my first machine online, and took it apart. I had to fix the sponge bar. Then some of the needles were bent and it needed like a full cleaning. So online, there's a great site, The Answer Lady and Catherine and her husband Jack, and they provide excellent footage about how to use a brother machine. So I relied on that heavily. I started to knit lots of samples. I wanted to learn how to use the ribber and the G carriage and the garter bar and all the accessories. And so I spent a lot of time making small swatches and looking at the texture in different yarns. And I really sort of settled on, I fell in love with lace, and specifically this Brother pattern 597 in the Brother punch card pattern book. And that's the lace pattern of the cardigan that I'm wearing. This is the first garment that I made that was full size. I made it in this special pattern that for one repeat, you really have to push a carriage across like over 70 times. And I really relaxed. I enjoyed it. I learned how to read my knitting. I learned how to repair drop stitches. And after making this cardigan, I just wanted to make more. So I made a couple of scarves and a sweater for my mother. And this one, because at the beginning I did not know how to read my knitting or fix mistakes, has some very kind of ugly fixes, so I've never worn this out of the house, and I just sewed in the ends in order to record this and wear this for this video. So I'll show you a couple of other sweaters that I have worn out of the house, and I also want to give you a demonstration on this Brother bulky 260, and I've cast on last week Caitlin Hunter's Soldatna, so you can see how it is to use the color changer and work in the round. And hopefully this will then be finished and I can show you the final sweater off the machine. I have in advance knitted the ribbed neckline, and so I'm going bottom up. I'm on the yoke, so it shouldn't be very much longer, and then I'll be able to show you the sweater hopefully in this video. This next sweater I'd like to show you is a summer top, and it's designed by Anne Wunsch, owning the local yarn shop, Anne's Yarn Design. And she designed this during the lockdown, and I decided to knit it in green. It has a baby cereal alpaca Rowan yarn from the waist up, and it's held in the plaiting feeder behind Habu silk mohair. So the silk mohair always appears on the front, and from the waist up, the thickness and texture of the sweater is slightly more substantial because of the Rowan yarn. And I was just running out of green, so in the back I just ad hoc spontaneously decided to put a couple of stripes of pink in the back, but that wasn't planned from the beginning. So I really enjoyed making this sweater and using the plaiting feeder. The mohair made sure that if I was in danger of dropping a stitch, the stitch didn't go anywhere. It really kind of stuck in place, so it was easy to fix if I dropped a stitch. The next sweater I'd like to show you is called Walk in the Dawn by Asita Krebs, and it's knitted in some merino singles called Marmee from the local yarn store. Anne Wunsch owns Anne's Yarn Design, and so I had several skeins in my stash of the speckly yarn, and I combined it in different ways. I first did a swatch, and I was not sure whether I wanted to use the slip pattern or the tuck pattern, but the tuck is substantially wider as a stitch pattern of the same number of stitches, and the inside, the non-public side, has a ripply, bumpy effect that I really think is beautiful, and it sort of mirrors the two-color pattern on the front. So I used all the skeins in my stash almost to make this. I added a hoodie, it doesn't come in the pattern. I doubled up the two-color pattern on the cuffs and the bottom hem in order just to make it a larger sweater for my size, a little bit extra long. So the tuck pattern is carried through the whole body. The swatch is just stockinette, but I really like the substance of the tuck pattern. So here's my finished soldatna, and it took quite a bit longer than I expected. It was probably 2 weekends and maybe altogether 15 hours. I didn't actually count, but that's a wild guess. And I think part of the problem was I swatched, my swatch was way too small, and so I didn't really learn a lot from this little swatch. And everything seemed to be moving along smoothly. I knitted all the ribbed bands in advance. I could do that in 30-45 minutes. Then moving from the bottom up, the body was easy. And then I got to the armhole, and that's kind of where I started to see some issues. My major issue was really the time that it took to do the hand transfers. I don't have a bulky garter bar. So I transferred the stitches with a 3-prong tool, which was time consuming. The yarn was sticking underneath the color changer, so when I switched yarns, there were a couple times where I moved the carriage across the bed with no yarn in it, which pushed live stitches off the needles. So it was okay when I could just rehang the stitch, but some of the stitches did run, and then I had to figure out the color sequence, and digging in between the ribber and the knitter and looking at the dark yarn was difficult. So that was not so much fun. The armbands in the end, after I took it off the machine and tried it on, were far too small. I couldn't close them, get the bands around my arm and close it at the bottom. So it was wide open with spread stitches. And I have to say thank you so much to the Knit It Now community. There's machine knitters there who've been machine knitting for decades. And they gave me some excellent advice in a very kind way on how to fix the issue. So you can see these are the old armbands, and now I have enough space. I think aesthetically it's black, so it's hard to see, but aesthetically it looks normal, and I have space to move. So this is the unblocked sweater, but I think all in all it turned out really nice. It's a beautiful kind of a shimmery merino, which I really like. So my next sweater is back to the merino singles lace, the same pattern that I've been using a lot, this Brother 597, and I'm going to knit the orange cardigan but in a dark blue for my sister-in-law as a gift, and it's a special present, so I'm excited to start that and finish that and give that to her. And I want to say thank you to Andrea and Andrew for all your work. You put on excellent podcasts. I enjoy and learn a lot, and I'm very grateful that you take all the time that you do for these shows that you offer on YouTube. So thank you very much.
we first met Jackie at the Swiss Yarn Festival earlier this year, and Jackie's also one of our patrons, and during a live event, she was telling us how, as a novice machine knitter, she'd bought a second-hand machine and she completely took it apart to clean it, because she had to clean it anyway, but she was also fascinated to see how the thing actually worked. So she took it all apart and then she successfully put it back together so that it could work. And she was quite animated when she was talking about doing that. And then she also told us how she would disappear for hours on end in her craft room and just completely get lost in the world of machine knitting. And hearing her talk like that really caught my attention. And I thought, here is a woman of true passion and commitment. She would be a fantastic guest on Knitters of the World. So with a little bit of arm twisting, we convinced Jackie to share her world with us, and we're really grateful that she did, because it was great to be able to feature a hobby machine knitter in the same episode as Susan. And because it is quite a lot of work, you know.
Yeah.
If you've never done this before, we do help our guests through every step of the way, but it's still a fair bit of work. And so we're really grateful to you, Jackie. You did a fantastic job, and thank you.
Yeah. It was good seeing her local yarn store there. It was a beautiful shop.
It's a beautiful shop. It looked very light and harmonious, and
Yeah.
you could get a lot of inspiration from it. And the models with that lace,
There
that
was some
mohair lace.
Good lace work there.
I wonder if that was on the machine or if that was hand knitted.
Not sure.
And I don't know if you did the same thing, but it was interesting to see her work on Soldatna, the Caitlin Hunter design, and my eyes just went straight to her colour work, and I noticed how neat and even all of her stitches were, but we're not allowed to get jealous. So that was really fun.
Yep.
So this show is only possible through the financial support of our patrons, and it is very inexpensive to become a patron. You can do so by making a small monthly contribution, and that means that we can just keep producing the show. And every single patron makes a big difference to us. So please do become a patron, and thank you so much to all of the wonderful viewers who have done that. We really appreciate you.
Yep, absolutely. One more quick bit of news from us. As you'll know, many of the festivals have been cancelled this year, but at this point we are still planning to go to the Fairnu Festival, which is happening in Denmark in September. We've got some great interviews lined up, and we're preparing for those right now, which is a lot of extra work on top of getting each episode ready.
Yeah.
So you may have noticed that this episode's come out a couple of days late. We are planning to release the next episode a couple of days late as well, just to give us a little bit of extra time to do that extra work. So that means that episode 106 will be out in about 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thanks for spending time with us again. We've really enjoyed your company. And coming up now is the part 2 of the interview with Susan Guagliumi, which you'll love.
Yep. Thanks
Okay.
for being with us. Bye.
Bye. Okay, now can you recommend some machines that are suitable for a hand knitter to start on? And also, when you're talking about machines in general, if you have any tips for the advanced machine knitters, that's great too.
There are a number of things to consider when you think about buying a machine, but first of all, you need to have some understanding of what the parts of a machine are. All knitting machines are made up of a bed with slots in it, with needles that, let me see if I can push one up, that these needles that slide back and forth, one needle per stitch. You've got the carriage that pushes the needles backwards and forwards, and that has various features built in or not built in. It might require an accessory to do certain kinds of things, like in Tarsha, or it may be built into the carriage. That would be a consideration. And then knitting machines have also got what's called an auto tension, and it's this antenna looking thing that's here behind the machine. And it does the same thing that your fingers do in hand knitting. All it does is tension the yarn to make sure that it feeds through at an even, consistent tension. That's assuming that it's wound into a smooth ball that isn't bouncing around on the floor someplace. But what machine is the best machine for you? Well, First of all, I'd say it's a machine that you can get some support and help with. And if that's a local yarn shop that handles machines, terrific. If there's a local knit club and there are people there that can help you, that's wonderful. I'd be really skeptical of a non-knitter buying a machine sight unseen on eBay or one of the other sites. You just don't know what you're getting. And I've heard horror stories of people getting what they thought was a new machine and it has no carriage, or the needles are all rusted out. And you'd have no way of knowing that as a new knitter, whether there's something wrong with the machine or if it's something you're doing wrong. So in that case, I would really suggest looking for a new machine, either through a reputable online source or through a local dealer. Once you've found that source, you need to ask yourself, what do I want to knit on this machine? Do I want to knit the very fine yarns that I don't like doing by hand? Lace weight, baby weight yarns. Those would require a standard gauge machine. The needles on a standard gauge machine are smaller and closer together than the needles that are on a mid gauge or a bulky machine that will handle DK weights and heavier, all the way up through probably like lightweight Lobe perhaps. The size of the needle hook has a lot to do with what yarns the machine can handle. So you need to have some idea of that to begin with. And people are surprised. They think, well, it's a machine, it should just do everything. That would be like expecting your size 6 hand knitting needles to do lace weight and super bulky. It just isn't going to work. The needles have to be able to accommodate the yarn. So first decision, what kind of yarn do I want to knit? And then what kinds of features am I interested in? Obviously, a manual machine where I will be selecting the needles with my hands or with tools is going to be less expensive than a punch card, which is also less expensive than an electronic or computer-operated machine. So that's another pretty big consideration. What yarns do I want to knit? How much do I want to spend? What kinds of garments do I want to do? Am I really, really focused on reproducing hand knit patterns? Then I would say you're probably looking for a mid-gauge or a bulky machine because they'll use all of the hand knitting yarns. Do you have access to good quality yarn on cones? Because that's what you'll probably need for a standard gauge machine. Finer yarns don't generally do well wound into little balls and set on the floor behind the machine. So the yarn considerations are huge. The money consideration for many of us is a huge consideration. And the kinds of things that you want to knit. And by that I mean the features that one machine may feature over another. There are machines that specialize in, for example, there were machines that did a garter stitch with a very expensive accessory, but it could be done. So if that was the look you were looking for, then you'd look around for an old used Brother machine with a G carriage. If you were more interested in Fair Isle patterning, they all do Fair Isle and they do it beautifully.
Now, what about sock machines and hat machines?
I stayed away from those because I'm just afraid they're too seductive, and I only have so many hours in the day and days in the week. I did have one of those little Addy hat machines for a while, and I found it fascinating. But I know that if I bring in one of the cast iron sock machines, I'll be lost in the world of socks forever. I don't know a lot about them, but I know that they're intriguing.
Okay, so just roughly give me a price range. What's a good price range for a mid-gauge starter machine, and what's the price range right at the top end for something computerized?
Okay. I think that one of the best machines out there for hand knitters is one that Silver Reed manufactures. It's called the LK150, and it runs, I think, about $450 here in the U.S. You occasionally find them used. It's a really sturdy manual machine. It's a plastic machine, not a stainless steel bed like this, which is what keeps the cost down. And I have one I've been using for 25 years. So it's a good sturdy machine, and it's a great starter machine. Most people tell me that they don't even get rid of it when they buy a more sophisticated machine later on. The top end of the line can go up to $1,500, $2,000, and if you start adding computer programs like Design a Knit, then there's an additional expense for the software and for the hookup to the machine.
You can see it's an expensive hobby, especially
It can be, it can be.
when you combine it with very high quality yarns as well. But
Yes.
it's all there. Okay, now your books and courses are really highly recommended in the machine knitting world. Can you talk us through some of your main books and online courses and say what level of machine knitter they're appropriate for?
The first book that I did was called Hand Manipulated Stitches for Machine Knitters, and it's been in print for close to 30 years now, and probably the best-selling machine knitting book out there, I'm very happy to say. The first chapter goes into great detail about how knitting machines work, and I've had people say that that's been eye-opening for them. For a beginner, to really understand why you're doing something is much more important than just doing it because a direction told you to do so. So that was the first book, and it's unfortunately just in black and white, but with lots of charts and photographs. The second book, More Hand Manipulated Stitches, very catchy title there, expands on one very specific technique in the first book, something that I call bridging, which is a use of short rows to access each and every individual stitch on the machine, either to change the stitch size or to add extra rows in a particular area of the fabric. It's what I find the most freeing way of working on a machine. The third book that I did was called Hand Knits by Machine, and explained things like the modular knitting that I showed you before, how to do entrelac on a machine, how to transfer over specific hand knit increases or decreases so that they make sense if you're trying to exactly replicate a sweater. And then the most recent book started out as one chapter of another book that kind of got shelved for the moment. It's called Open Spaces, Eyelets, Ladders, and Slits. And it's focused on extreme textures. So for example, the sweater that I'm wearing has 5 stitch eyelets, which is not exactly your grandmother's lace. And most of the slit sweaters, let me just grab one here for you. The slits are large-scale, elaborate slits that are used to create more contemporary open spaces. So that's what that whole book is focused on. And in fact, I also did a 7-hour companion course to go with it. That's on my teachable.com website. The classes that I did for Craftsy, which is now called Blueprint, there were 3 of them, and they were all taught, incidentally, on that little plastic hobby machine, because the machine is probably, again, the lowest common denominator, and the information would transfer over to more sophisticated machines quite easily. But it made the information available to beginning students. And those 3 classes are in order: Knitting Machine Essentials, the basics, explaining about tension and stitch formation and so forth. Color and Texture, where we go into detail on intarsia and entrelac, among other things. And the last one was an assortment of hand manipulated stitches. And I continue to post short videos on my blog, which also broadcast on YouTube. So there's a lot of visual information out there. I think it's a very visual craft, and that with an absence of good teachers in a lot of areas, I think the video instruction is even more important than it's ever been.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Now, just getting back to open spaces, the German company Stoll opened their archives to you, and you were able to go in and deconstruct and reproduce some of their samples for open spaces. So can you just tell us a little bit, what was it like to be able to go into the archives? Their archives were in New York, and just have access to see so many, actually thousands of textile samples. And how did these industrial samples help you with open spaces?
Finding the Stoll archives was the best thing that happened to me. I was in New York City teaching at Vogue Knitting Live, and I was trolling through the garment district and stumbled upon the Stoll headquarters. I'd forgotten they were there. And when I went in and introduced myself, I was really flattered because the woman who was working there knew who I was and said, "Oh, you should really take advantage of our archives." And I said, "Well, I'm working on a book right now, so that would be great." "Oh, come in and look through." So I bought a year's membership to the archives and went downstairs that first day. I was like a kid in a candy store. There were about 6 or 7 aisles with racks on both sides, double hung, with swatches mostly swatches, some partial garments, some pieces of garments that went back decades of things that had been done at Stoll. And I probably could have gotten lost in there for a month. But what I did was to just go through the racks, and anything that had any kinds of holes or open spaces in it at all, I pulled out, took photographs, took notes, never enough notes. I had a number of things that I got home and had to scratch my head over. And I was able to go back to the archives probably a dozen times over the course of the year, and to open my eyes to other possibilities, things that I hadn't really considered and that contributed to what I call the what ifs. What if I do it this way? What if I always move the stitches to the left or to the right? What if I do it 5 times instead of 4 times? What if I knit fewer rows, more rows in between? All of those variables, and so many of them had already been expressed in one way or another at Stoll. So it really was instrumental. Once in a lifetime opportunity. So, and in fact, some of the garments or the techniques that were worked up are really, upside down, are really directly related to Stoll garments. There were a couple of Stoll garments that had these very open slits that are worked all continuously. It's kind of hard to explain quickly, but continuously worked, and with the cables to join them. Again, not exactly your grandmother's lace. This stitch is based on one of the Stoll fabrics, a sideways knitted garment, where it's, again, 3-stitch eyelets that are worked every couple of rows. And things like this could not be done on a machine with an automatic lace carriage. An industrial machine, yes, but on a domestic machine with lace carriage, no. This would have to be worked with the hand tools, and that's really what I love doing the best. So in the book, there are hundreds and hundreds of fabrics, and I usually keep them all in books like this so I can go back to them. In this case, working with diagonal slits that are a little bit different to work with and create totally different patterns. And then what happens if I do it in 2 colors? So, those what ifs sneaking in and taking some ideas that maybe weren't that interesting to begin with and then adding more texture to them to expand on those ideas one from the other.
So all of that's really for the advanced machine knitter, I imagine, open spaces.
I don't think so. I think that a beginning machine knitter would find plenty of the basic operations that would be doable. I think, yes, some of them definitely get into more involved fabrics, but you pick and choose what you're ready for and what interests you. And all of these have charts and full directions with them.
I imagine that a competent hand knitter would find that fairly easy to pick up. Is that correct? Because they're already used to doing these manipulations and they understand where stitches go. Yeah?
Yes, and I think that a competent hand knitter who's made the switch over to a machine and begins to think in machine speak instead of hand speak would be able to work from the charts without any difficulty.
So where are you going to go next with your machine knitting education material?
I'm trying something new right now. For the most part, as you can probably tell by, I said there are dozens of these books, I'm a process knitter. I love the exploration. I sometimes feel when I knit a sweater, by the time I get to the second sleeve, that I'm doing production knitting. I'm not always as interested in the garment, but I know that most of my students have a machine because they want to knit garments. And the thing that I hear all the time, particularly with there being fewer shops than there used to be, is that people would really like some hand-holding to get through a garment. So, for example, the sweater that's next to me is one that I just finished. And it's a traveling stitch pattern with eyelets alongside the traveling stitches. And I'm not only doing it as a written pattern, I'm doing it as a video pattern. So anything that would need extra explanation, like how to begin and end partial patterns at the sides, or how to short row the neckline in pattern, all of that is being shown on video. And I hope to have that done by the end of the summer.
I can see that would be something that knitters would really enjoy and be able to
I hope
just
so.
this
I
step
hope
by
so.
step. Now tell me, do machine knitters also have to seam by hand?
You can do some of it by hand. There's some you can do on the machine. As I said, there's a method on the machine that's like a 3-needle bind-off.
Okay, great. But machines don't knit in the round, do they?
They do, but not well.
Okay.
I mean, I could do plain circular stockinette,
Yeah.
but they only pattern on one bed generally.
Okay, so one final question. I know that you've travelled around to various countries teaching machine knitting, so I'm just wondering if you have any stories that highlight the cultural differences as to how people approach machine knitting. And then maybe at the end you can even say what you think the future is for machine knitting.
There are big differences. When students purchased machines in Japan, they weren't allowed to bring the machines home. They had to leave them at the knitting machine dealer's store and come in and take a series of lessons before they were allowed to take them home. I thought that was fascinating. And I found that the Japanese knitters didn't need the row-by-row, stitch-by-stitch directions. They're very used to working from a schematic and tailor making to go with their own measurements. I found that both England and Australia were surprising because they have huge wool industries, and yet an awful lot of the knitters tended to favor acrylic yarns over the wools. That really was surprising for me.
Wow.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I was fascinated by, I've gone over to teach a number of times in Norway, and this is a country with a strong hand knit tradition, and in the last 10 years or so they have really embraced machine knitting. There's a lot of very innovative work going on in Norway, and I have to assume the other Scandinavian countries as well.
And do they have preferences in what they like to do with the machines? Is, on the gauge that they like to knit with, or what kind of items they like to do, or what kind of techniques? Have you seen differences there between the countries?
The British and the Australian markets tend to prefer standard gauge machines. I remember the first time that I mentioned a mid-gauge machine when I was lecturing in the south of England. There were 200 or 300 people in the room, and a hand shot up and said, "We don't know what you're talking about." They hadn't even seen the mid-gauge machines yet. So they tend to like a lot of the standard gauge machines. The Norwegians were interested in lots and lots of texture and contemporary looks. I think the thing about machine knitting that I've always found frustrating a little bit is that it's too easy to get seduced by what the machines can do and to forget about what's in style. So sometimes I'll see people knitting things that are beautifully knitted, but no one's wearing some of those garments. And I think that hand knitters tend to be a lot more fashion forward than the average machine knitter.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, and what would you say the basic age group or the demographic is of machine knitters? Can you say that?
It's changed.
Yeah?
It's changed. Back in the 90s, I would have said that it was mostly older women.
Uh-huh.
And what I'm seeing now is a lot of 30 and 40-somethings. I think what's happened is, as a result of the continued boom in hand knitting in this country in particular, people are much more open to machines than they ever used to be. I mean, back in the 80s, they'd walk by us at a trade show and say, "Oh, that's cheating, that's terrible." Now they say, "Oh, what kind of machine is that?" They're much more open to it, and I think younger people, who are, after all, a computer generation, are much more interested in equipment and machines and less intimidated by them.
Yeah, okay. Well, that sounds like good news for the future of
I hope
machine
so.
knitting. Yeah. What can you say about the future of machine knitting? What do you think some challenges are, and what do you think, what's your opinion?
I think the challenge is the same one that's been ongoing, that the ideal situation is a local teacher or yarn shop or guild that can support you while you're knitting. But what they're up against is all of the competition on the internet, and it makes it harder for them to stay in business. So my prime recommendation is always support your local yarn shop, support what you've got before you lose it.
Definitely. And what about looking after the machines? I suppose a modern machine that you're going to buy now, it's pretty easy to look after, is it? But perhaps the old ones that are still around, is it getting harder and harder to find somebody who can actually repair them, or can a knitter repair their own machine?
Some repairs you can do on your own. There are parts that are replaceable that do need to be replaced from time to time. But you're right, some of the older repair people are dying out. There's probably a good opportunity for somebody to do some repair. If you've got a machine that's in need of repair, you could probably contact one of the universities or schools that offers a knitting program, because they've either got someone on staff that does repairs or can recommend someone who does.
Well, Susan, it's been a real privilege to have you on Fruity Knitting and just to have you share your knowledge and expertise with our audience. I think they'll be really thrilled and inspired to hear what you've got to say and see what you can do on machines. So thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thank you so much. It went by very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, let's say goodbye to the audience. Bye.
Bye-bye.